I will now talk about the Neoclassical Revolution and how it changed our notion and our theory of value. The Neoclassicals argue that value is relative, that it depends on how much you want something relative to how much there is of that something, that this value is based on consumption and production, and it is essentially equal to what Aristotle would call the value in exchange. And the whole idea that there is some sort of absolute value or some sort of intrinsic value was abandoned in the Neoclassical Revolution, or perhaps not abandoned but replaced by something else, and that something else is consumer sovereignty. So the starting point in the Neoclassical theory of value is a utility function, and those utility functions are not something that we as analysts can pronounce on. No, they are given, and that is because consumers are, and we don't have an opinion about what consumers should be, but rather we take consumers and their preferences as given. And that is the absolute standard that we have. Of course, we can't know a utility function, we can only know a utility function up to a defined transformation, but that doesn't matter because what is reflected in the market is not so much utility, not so much total utility, but rather utility at the margin. And in that sense, Neoclassicals argued that the market is amoral, not immoral, but amoral. Also not moral, no, amoral. There is no value judgment contained in this. Preferences are what they are, and value reflects those preferences, full stop. And that makes values relative, they make values contextual, they depend on, obviously, supply and demand, but also such things as uncertainty, that uncertain returns are worth less than certain returns, and of course it depends on both absolute and relative scarcity. Absolute scarcity in the sense that if something is unique, that if there's only one of something, it's obviously worth more than if there's multiple copies. And this is a very, very different notion than what any economists before the Neoclassical Revolution thought about value, where there was always some sort of absolute yardstick. No, it's completely overboard. Since the Neoclassical Revolution, value is relative. It's also something that is very hard to grasp for non-economists. A lot of people who are outside of economics continue to believe that Aristotle and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Adam Smith, Karl Marx, that there is some sort of absolute notion of value. No, say economists since neoclassical times. The measures of value that we nowadays use go back to John Hicks, and you see displayed here, one of the Nobel laureates in economics. And there's two notions of value that he defines, and we'll come back to them, both of them later. One is the Hexane equivalent variation, more commonly known as willingness to pay, and that is essentially a reflection of the value of something you don't have. How much the willingness to pay, the Hexane equivalent variation, is how much I value something that I don't have is measured by the most in terms of money that I am willing to give up in order to gain it. And that is your supermarket scenario. That the willingness to pay is you see a jar of peanut butter and how much are you prepared to pay for that. Willingness to accept compensation is the other fundamental measure defined by Hicks, and it's also known as his compensating variation. And that is, suppose that I have something and I lose it, how much what is the minimum I am willing to accept as compensation in order to make up for my loss? And that is a concept of value that we use to assess damage done. So the two are opposite in the sense that one, you don't have something, you buy it, or you want to buy it, and how much are you prepared to pay for that? And the other is you have something, you lose it, and how much do we need to compensate you for your loss to make you equally well off? And these measures, and willingness to pay is the one that you're more used to. You have willingness to pay at one point, and then you have multiple points. You can draw a demand curve, and then you can integrate under the demand curve to find your consumer surplus and your producer surplus, right? So those are our current measures of value, and I repeat, they are very, very different from historical theories of value.